A despicable murder thought up in an online chat room and 2 killers with no remorse. These 2 boys thought they had committed a perfect crime, but thanks to 1.4 billion pages of data, we know exactly what they did. This is the shocking story of how Kimberly Proctor was brutally killed by 2 out-of-control teenagers, after they planned it all out online. The following story is one that reminds us to exercise caution when chatting on the internet. Though that warning is usually reserved for communication with strangers, Kimberly Proctor met a gruesome end because she had actually been talking to 2 people she considered her friends. Kimberly was a troubled girl with a passion for pets. She kept so many animals that her father once declared the family garage full of cages. Kimberly's love for animals likely came about due to her struggles with people, in particular the other kids at school. The young girl was relentlessly bullied, and this, combined with her attention deficit disorder, eventually led to Kimberly being transferred to Pacific Secondary School, an alternative school specifically for children struggling in various aspects of life. It was at this school that Kimberly met 16-year-old Kruse and 17-year-old Cameron Moffat. These 2 boys were troubled, though far more so than most kids at this school, or any alternative school for that matter. The pair met back in 5th grade, seemingly developing a friendship as Kruse had a high tolerance for Cameron's usually unwelcome antics. Cameron had a long history of violence and antisocial behavior. He had been sexually abused as a child, and as a teenager would self-harm using knives, lash out at his family members and fellow students, and even bring weapons into the school. While most kids would find Cameron's behavior disturbing, to say the least, Kruse seemingly encouraged it. The 2 would regularly skip school together. They would watch adult movies and smoke, and eventually, they would share sickening fantasies with each other. Much of Cameron and Kruse's concerning conversations would take place in online chats, a place where many teenagers feel safe to be themselves. In 2009, Cameron made a blog post that, when viewed today, stands as a hair-raising red flag. It contained Cameron's thoughts about how he had all the makings of a murderer. The peculiar thing is, I meet all 14 criteria of a serial killer. Apparently, though meeting all criteria makes it unlikely for the subject to be a serial killer. I suppose only time will tell. Cameron Moffat. The tale time would tell would be absolutely horrific. With Kimberly having few friends, she gravitated toward a friendship group of outcasts like herself. This included both Cameron and Kruse. After Kimberly suffered a rough breakup with another member of the group, Cameron saw his opportunity to confess his feelings for Kimberly in an online chat. "There aren't many beautiful things I've seen, but I must say you are one of them." Around this same time, Kimberly was also chatting online with Kruse. When she shared insecurities about her appearance, Kruse, much like Cameron, saw an opportunity to compliment his female friend. "You're beautiful the way you are." As this love triangle edged closer toward disaster, Kruse and Cameron began to indulge in increasingly disturbing behavior together. They experimented by drinking blood and other bodily fluids. They visited websites featuring sadistic adult content and took their drug use to more serious substances. The 2 also discussed their fantasies of murder and how they could specifically carry out such an act. Kruse even managed to get Kimberly on a phone call, during which he made it possible for Cameron to listen in without Kimberly's knowledge or consent. As this innocent girl chatted with Kruse, Cameron and his best friend shared messages online. Kruse, "I'm going to rip her nose ring out and burn it. Burn her flesh." Cameron, "Yai, not keep her bound and alive." Kruse, "That's what I'm going to do, but I need to get her stoned first and possibly seduce her." Cameron, "LOL, try quickly." Viewed without context, this message could come across as strange, perhaps even as a harmless, albeit disturbing message exchange between 2 teenage boys. The problem was, Cameron and Kruse were no ordinary teenage boys, and by this point, they had already decided to commit an unthinkable act against their friend. On March 18, 2010, in Vancouver, Canada, Cameron Moffat spent approximately $17 on camping fuel at the local Canadian Tire department store. He, Kruse, and Kimberly then all met up at a bus stop and then visited Kruse's house. It was here that the two teenage boys would unleash their planned attack on Kimberly. This was no spur-of-the-moment incident, as Kruse had even prepared a code phrase to alert Cameron as to when to begin the vicious assault. "I think I'm going to make some KD," would be the sinister signal to let Cameron know the time was right. The term KD is popular among Canadians and refers to Kraft macaroni and cheese. Kruse likely deemed this inconspicuous enough not to alarm Kimberly. After the three teens arrived at the house on Happy Valley Road, Kruse didn't wait long before blurting out the code phrase. The verbal cue was followed by the boys violently beating Kimberly, tying her up, sexually assaulting her, shoving a sock into her mouth, and attacking her with a knife. Cameron and Kruse then duct-taped Kimberly and threw her inside a freezer. While this may seem like a macabre attempt to hide a dead body, when Kimberly was placed into the freezer, she was still alive. With Kimberly trapped, Kruse headed online to send Kimberly one last message, likely an attempt to give himself an alibi. "Kruse, are you done babysitting yet?" While Kruse was typing out this part of his plan, his other friends spotted him online and unsurprisingly reached out. "Dude, speak." It would be 8 minutes before Kruse responded to his friend Kruse. "Sorry, the freezer was jumping around." Kimberly's cause of death was asphyxiation. She likely suffocated whilst locked inside the freezer. The following morning, Cameron and Kruse stuffed Kimberly's body inside a gym bag. They then headed back to the bus stop with Kimberly's corpse and caught a ride to the Galloping Goose hiking trail. Searching for the perfect place to hide the body of the teenage girl that they had recently murdered in sickening fashion, Cameron and Kruse decided on a spot underneath a bridge. This is when the two boys put the previously purchased camping fuel to use as they set the bag and its contents on fire. The two teenagers then left the scene, leaving the incriminating evidence behind. This fact seemingly weighed little on their minds, as both Cameron and Kruse carried on with their day as normal. Kruse went to spend the day with his girlfriend, and Cameron went out for brunch with his mom and grandmother. That same evening, at around 7 p.m., a local man stumbled across the ashes and charred remains left behind by the teenage boys. A team of over 40 officers was quickly assembled to tackle the case, and soon enough, dental records from the remains were able to confirm the body as that of Kimberly Proctor. Law enforcement had solved the mystery of the whereabouts of this missing girl, but they now had to figure out who had killed Kimberly. As the town mourned the loss of the 18-year-old, police kept a close eye on the internet activity of those who knew her. In the aftermath of the murder, Kruse Wellwood was arrested for assaulting his own mother, though he was conveniently out on bail in time to attend Kimberly's memorial service. Perhaps in Kruse's mind, hiding in plain sight was the safest way to keep from getting caught. After the service, a memorial page was set up for Kimberly on Facebook, and while some people touched by the 18-year-old girl shared their memories and tributes, others used the page to discuss theories about who might have killed her. Amateur detectives or not, these theories and ideas were closely watched by law enforcement. After all, it was likely that somebody who knew Kimberly knew something about how she died. During this time, Kruse grew increasingly afraid that his dark secret would be brought to light, and so, in an attempt to lighten the burden on his own conscience after just 5 days, he decided to confess his crime in the one place he felt safe: online. Even though Kruse was an avid user of online messaging, he did suspect that police could catch him should he confess in a regular chat room, so with an extra cautious approach, the teenager headed into the popular video game World of Warcraft to chat with his online girlfriend. Kruse then confessed the horrific crime through text, typing out the unthinkable details for the girl to read. Cameron joined the chat shortly afterward, adding authenticity to the likely unbelievable story Kruse was telling. The girl allegedly told Kruse she would always be there for him no matter what. a statement the teenager seemed to greatly appreciate as the chat continued. Kruse, no matter how things turn out, I'll make it up to you somehow, one day. Girl, what about her family and her friends and all whose lives you have ruined? Cameron, no, I don't feel bad for them. After this exchange, Kruse changed the topic of conversation to video games, and no more was said about Kimberly's horrible murder. Between these three, at least. As soon after, Cameron and Kruse were back messaging each other about their sick and twisted fantasies, and Cameron even suggested killing again because killing Kimberly had proven so easy. In addition to the unsettling online behavior, Kruse also caught attention at school after getting into an argument with another student about Kimberly. Kruse was allegedly overheard talking about the deceased girl, and this prompted one of Kimberly's friends to ask him to stop. This reportedly sent the boy into a rage. He allegedly stood up and began screaming that no one cares. This was followed by another similar incident with a different student. This one claimed that Kruse stated the following, "I'm glad she's dead. I hated her." With so much noise coming from Kimberly's killers, police were closing in. They bugged the boys' cell phones, houses, and hangout spots, and with a forensic investigation of both Cameron's and Kruse's computers, investigators eventually found themselves with 1.4 billion pages of data to analyze. On June 18, 2010, Cameron Moffat and Kruse Wellwood were arrested. Cameron's interrogation began 2 days later. You may not be shocked to find that this deeply disturbed killer kept remarkably calm throughout and gave chilling responses to many questions, such as, why did he set Kimberly's body on fire? Cameron shared that it was not just to hide evidence, but also to erase the full extent of the horrors they had inflicted on Kimberly. During this interrogation, which lasted over 8 hours, Cameron was also asked how he felt when committing the brutal murder. His response was not only said with a sinister smile and lacked any remorse, but the seriousness of the situation seemed to escape him even when sat across from law enforcement. This would become even more apparent as Cameron Moffat toyed with his interrogators, refusing to share complete details and purposely providing vague answers to questions. When Cameron finally does decide to share details, it is seemingly with the intent of painting Kruse Wellwood as not just his partner in a horrendous crime, but the mind and motivator behind it all. Kruse would play a similar tactic when questioned, pointing fingers at Cameron with the intended result of lessening his own personal involvement in Kimberly's death. Despite both boys being in custody, neither seemed fazed by their predicaments. Cameron and Kruse were even recorded having what they believed to be a private conversation whilst in the back of a police van. They were really trying to stroke my ego, telling me how smart they think I am. Kruse Wellwood Cameron's response proves he was just as unperturbed by the prospect of going to prison. I just laughed at half the things they said and sat there with a big grin on my face. Cameron Moffat Kruse and Cameron pleaded guilty to Kimberly's murder and an additional charge of indignity to human remains. Both teenagers were given adult sentences due to the horrendous nature of their crimes. They were both sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. When carrying out the sentencing, the judge described Kimberly's murder as so horrific that words could not adequately describe the inhuman cruelty. For Kimberly's family, Cameron and Kruse's punishments were nowhere near severe enough. Kimberly's mother spoke after the sentencing and made it clear that the two boys that killed her daughter do not deserve a second chance in life. I don't even like to call them because Kim was such an animal lover. To me, they're just... The unforgivable act of killing from both Cameron and Kruse now meant they would spend considerable time behind bars. They may well consider themselves lucky that Canada does not have the death penalty, and therefore the wishes of Kimberly's parents could not come true. In a truly disturbing case of a son following in his father's footsteps, Kruse's sentencing as an adult meant he would possibly join his own dad behind bars in the same institution. In 2001, Wellwood's father assaulted and beat a 16-year-old girl to death. He is currently serving a life sentence for the crime. At the time, Kruse Wellwood's lawyer touched on the fear Kruse felt as he faced years in prison, and how that level of fear may have been because of his family history. He's still only 17, and to place him in the hardened environment of the federal penitentiary, where he is going to be the subject of bullying or sex attacks, has made him very afraid. I don't know if that's because his father is there and has told him things. Bob Jones. In 2020, 10 years after Kimberly's murder, Kruse Wellwood appeared before the parole board seeking full parole and the privilege of escorted day passes. He was denied and once again categorized as an individual with a high risk of reoffending. It was also revealed that Kruse is still known for violent and angry outbursts, though this violence is always directed toward himself. Despite all of this, Kruse Wellwood will be eligible for parole again in 2027. Kimberly's father still feels as though justice has not been served. I get cranked up about it. In this country, it's the families of the victims that serve the life sentence. Fred Proctor. The fact that both Cameron Moffett and Kruse Wellwood could soon be walking free in society may now be the most frightening aspect of this case. Many still wonder what could possibly have driven two teenage boys to do such unspeakable things to a girl who had done nothing to wrong them. Both Cameron and Kruse were assessed psychologically. Both were found to be sexual deviants, and both were found to have psychopathic characteristics. There may have been warning signs that these two boys were capable of such horrors. But they went unnoticed, despite both of them being victims of childhood sexual abuse and having histories of violence. In the years since Kimberly's death, the Pacific Secondary School has introduced a violence threat protocol in the hopes that it will prevent such a tragedy from ever happening to a student again. For Kimberly Proctor, it is too little too late. And for her family, the suffering will only continue as they are left to dread the day that both Cameron and Kruse are released from prison. While it may have been impossible to predict such a stomach-turning attack from the two teenage boys, could this crime have been prevented by the school? Perhaps the system failed all three teenagers, or perhaps Cameron and Kruse were always destined to commit murder no matter what.
Why did Nicholas Browning, fun-loving Boy Scout and bright student, wind up murdering his whole family? I'm Allie, and this is Killer Bites, the show giving you bite-sized coverage of the hottest true crime cases. This case took place a while back, February 2008 to be precise. It ultimately begs the question, do you deserve leniency if you have a good reason for killing your whole family? Before you decide on an answer, here's the tea, and trust, it's piping hot. The case involved 15-year-old Nicholas Browning, born in 1992. He was the eldest son of John Browning, a business attorney, his mother Tamara Browning, and his two younger brothers Benjamin and Gregory Browning. Nick was described by his friends as very nice and a good student. Hard to believe a guy like that would commit a crime like this, right? Nick and his family and friends lived in the suburb of Cockeysville, Maryland, a calm and quiet area. The evening of February 2nd, 2008, Nick's parents and brother Benjamin dropped him off at his friend 15-year-old Ryan Fingal's house for a sleepover with their two other friends, 15-year-old Taylor Tewksbury and 15-year-old Alexander Smith. Tragically, that was the last time Nick's family was seen alive. The following morning, Nick, Ryan, Taylor, and Alexander went to Nick's house and discovered Nick's parents and younger brothers dead from gunshot wounds. Furthermore, a door had been left unlocked. The police were notified and took all four boys into custody for interrogations. Nick immediately claimed it was a burglary. Here's the background. The four boys are each placed in separate rooms. Heads up, the fellas have a tough time keeping their stories straight in the beginning. Maybe it's the fear of going to prison forever? The interrogation started with Taylor, who seemed the most nervous due to his constant fidgeting. He also seemed the most likely to tell the truth. According to his account, him, Alex, and Nick spent the night at Ryan's house. After school, the day before the murder, Taylor, Alex, and Nick arrived at Ryan's house where they played video games and watched movies. Ryan's parents were at the home as well. The detective interrogating Taylor takes a break and speaks with Nick in another room. Nick's head was down and he seemed half asleep until the detective entered. Not a good look for a seemingly innocent kid whose family was just murdered. The detective presents himself as someone friendly to build rapport with Nick, which apparently is a useful tactic to lower the chances of a suspect lying. The detective reads Nick his Miranda rights and goes straight into the interrogation, effectively preventing Nick from getting defensive and asking for an attorney. Nick is actually very well composed and calm about it all, which is definitely the sort of behavior to give a sigh side-eye at. Based on Nick's account, he got home from school at 2:45 p.m. the day before and went to Ryan's house after. The detective then goes and gets Ryan's account. He says they all spent the whole evening at his house and at one point went for a walk around the neighborhood. Ryan further reveals that Nick's house is fairly close by, only a half-mile away. He went on to mention that Nick went back home around 12:30 a.m. with plans to sneak and get his car so they could all go for a drive. Ryan explains that Nick told them when he got to his house all the lights were on. Assuming his parents were awake, he hopped in his car and fell asleep. That's very hard to believe. Upon discovering that he'll no longer be able to sneak away with the car, why didn't he just go back to Ryan's house? Why get in the car at all? Furthermore, the time Ryan mentions is around the same time Nick's family is murdered. If Nick was there, wouldn't he have seen or heard this alleged burglary? And who would burglarize a house with the lights on? Ryan also reveals that Alex called Nick later to check on him, and that's when Nick said he'd fallen asleep and would head back to Ryan's house. After this, the detective goes back to Taylor to see if Ryan and Nick's versions of the events checked out. Taylor says he fell asleep and woke up around 12 a.m. He also says Nick was there during this time. However, he quickly changes his mind and says Nick was actually gone. At this point, Taylor is hesitant to reveal more information and continues to fidget. It seems like he's afraid of what'll happen if he rats on his friend. He should be more concerned about going to juvie for lying for Nick. The detective manages to get Taylor to relax, and this causes Taylor to mention how Nick told him he was to grab his car but wound up not being able to. Taylor had gone to sleep after Nick left. When he woke up, Nick was back and said he'd fallen asleep in the car and walked back to Ryan's. This is consistent with Ryan's account of what Nick did. This doesn't mean Nick is out of the hot seat though. The detective gets back to Nick, who says he went home around 1:30 a.m. to try and get his car. The keys, however, were inside the house and the lights were on. Nick said the lights being on put him off of taking the car as it would be going against his parents' wishes. So he went and sat in the car and waited for them to turn the lights off and fall asleep. I found this a little suspicious. If you couldn't get the keys to his car presumably, how did he get in his car? Something definitely doesn't add up with this story. Nick wound up falling asleep and got woken up by a call from Alex around 5 a.m. asking for his whereabouts. After speaking briefly, Nick walked back to Alex's house. The detective goes back to Alex, who has an entirely different version of what happened. According to Alex, he and Nick slept in Ryan's living room and Nick never left the house. Interesting, right? The detective calls out Alex and says two of the other boys said Nick did in fact leave. He uses a scare tactic to get Alex to fess up. It works, and Alex admits that Nick did leave Ryan's house to go and get his car around 12:45 a.m. Alex further revealed that he fell asleep around 1 a.m., woke up around 5 a.m. and called Nick, who said he intended to get the keys but fell asleep in the car for about 3 hours. The detective goes back to Ryan, who also confirms that Nick was gone for about 3 hours. Now that the detective has gotten everyone's accounts for the night before, he asks everyone about the events leading up to the discovery of the crime scene the following morning. Taylor said the following morning after Nick returned to Ryan's house, they all had breakfast and got ready to leave. Alex's father, Mr. Pat, drove all the boys to Nick's house because they were going to spend the night there next. Taylor mentioned Nick had been worried because apparently Nick's mom was supposed to pick him up at 9 a.m. to clean the house, but she never came. He further mentioned Nick had been calling them since 11 a.m. and left messages, all of which went unanswered. Nick's account was similar to what Taylor said. He called his parents all morning after the murder and no one answered. Nick is good at playing up innocence. He presented a facade of caring about his family to try and convince detectives that he'd never harm them. No wonder the guy made it into AP classes. Ryan added a few more details that morning. He revealed that him, Taylor, Nick, and Alex went to the mall before Mr. Pat took them to Nick's house. He also maintains that Nick was worried about his parents because he hadn't heard from them. How could a boy so worried about his parents go to the mall instead of going home straight away? Something wasn't right. Nick added to his account of that morning. He mentions the mall trip and says when they all arrived at his house afterwards, they entered through the garage and walked through the door leading into the kitchen. Nick made sure to point out that the door was unlocked, which was unusual to him because it normally isn't. When the boys walked through the living room, Nick said the first thing he saw was his father, John, dead on the couch covered in blood. Nick and the other three boys went and talked to Mr. Pat before he drove away. Mr. Pat entered and called 911 as Nick went upstairs and found his mom and brothers dead as well. The crazy part, aside from the crime itself, is that as Nick recounted this, he showed absolutely no emotion. Granted, it could have been shock, or he could have been the type of person to suppress everything and let it out later on, but there would be some sort of initial concern or confusion about such a horrific event, right? Nick was just way too relaxed for a guy whose immediate family had just been murdered so randomly. After this, the detective went and got Ryan's account of the crime scene. Ryan said that Nick's dad was on the couch, bloody and pale. They went and got Mr. Pat, who came in and moved the boys away from Nick's dad. Nick and Ryan went upstairs and found his mom dead in the master bedroom bedroom and his brothers dead in their room, all covered in blood. After this, Ryan took Nick outside. Next, the detective got Alex's account of the scene. Alex said he stayed by the stairs near the entrance of the home because he didn't want to see anything. Alex recounted Nick stating that he saw blood on his father right when Mr. Pat was about to pull off from dropping them off. Finally, the detective got Taylor's statement about the scene. Taylor said he saw Nick's dad dead on the couch and immediately ran outside to get Mr. Pat. He added that Mr. Smith came in yelling, asking John, Nick's father, if he was okay. Taylor then handed the home phone to Mr. Pat, who called 911. Taylor further confirms that Nick went upstairs and found his mother and brothers dead. At one point, Taylor revealed that he and the other boys went outside and ran around the back of Nick's house to find any clues as to what happened. He said Nick opened the back door into the basement and saw his Xbox and Wii on the pool table. Think about that for a sec. What burglar breaks in, slaughters a family, but doesn't steal anything? Game consoles have a lot of value. Why leave them? The story got even more wild as interrogations continued and more information was brought to light. The detective visited Alex again for more details. Alex maintained that Nick never drove his car. However, what he said next put a big dent in Nick's story. Alex mentioned that while they were at the mall that morning, Nick told them he couldn't get the keys. Later, however, Nick pulled the keys out of his jacket pocket and said he didn't even know that they were in there. This was obviously inconsistent to what Nick told the detective, which was that he never got the keys. Why would Nick leave out the part that he discovered them in his jacket pocket? Why lie? Nick was definitely hiding something. The detective switched tactics and asked the boys about Nick's home life. The information about Nick's private life that the boys gave added even more suspicion in Nick's involvement in the crime. Taylor revealed that Nick got in trouble a couple of times for drinking. After a few prompting questions from the detective, Taylor said that Nick never had a gun on him or talked about it, and never mentioned being abused by his parents. Nick's own account about his personal life was that he was a good student, a good golf player, and that he got along well with his parents. After some prompting, Nick added that his dad didn't have any enemies and never mentioned any issues at work. At this point, Nick's story began to unravel, and it became clearer and clearer that he was responsible for murdering his family. The detective spoke with Alex again and asked him if he knew anything else. Alex said no, and the detective left. 10 minutes later, the detective returned, and Alex said he remembered something. Conversation that followed was huge. Alex revealed that Nick called his brothers the night before and told them to keep the basement door unlocked so he could enter the house. Alex was definitely holding back information before, presumably to protect Nick. It's safe to guess that once the reality of the situation settled in, Alex got scared and decided to come clean. The detective moved back to Taylor to see if Alex's recollection was true. Get this, Taylor confirmed that Nick called his brothers but said he didn't know what was discussed. The detective asked if Nick told his brothers to leave the back door open, and Taylor said yes. Taylor was very nervous and anxious by that point. He continued to fidget and stumble on his words a little. The detective went back to Nick after this. Nick's story gets even more flimsy. Nick recounted that after Mr. Pat came back, him and the boys went out back to the basement side door, which was unlocked. He added that the door is usually locked and that if he had to guess how anyone got in, it would be via the basement. The detective asked Nick when he last saw his parents. Nick replied that he last saw them when they dropped him off at Ryan's the night before. The detective then asked Nick if he spoke to his parents at all that night after being dropped off. Nick didn't give a straight answer, and instead said that the plan was for them to come pick him up at 9 a.m. the following morning. Nick added that he never spoke to his brothers that night either, and that he first tried contacting his family around 10 a.m. the following morning. He received no responses. That was a lie, given that both Taylor and Alex said Nick called his brothers that night. Nick also maintained that he left Ryan's house at 1:30 a.m. to go and get his car, and claimed that he didn't know how long it took him to get there since he got lost. At this point, it seemed like Nick was deliberately giving the detective a time that is later than when the crime took place to mislead the cops. Nick must have known the police were getting more and more suspicious of him. Nick went on to explain that he arrived at Ryan's house around 3 a.m. and confirmed with the detective that his dad had 2 gun lockers. Nick listed the guns his father owned, adding that they've gone hunting before and he was familiar with how to use a gun. When the detective asks where the keys to the gun lockers are, Nick said he didn't know. The detective returned to Taylor for more information. Taylor revealed some concerning things about Nick and his father's relationship. Taylor noted that Nick told him his father called him a failure. In an apparent effort to make Nick look better, Taylor added that Nick did well in school and took AP classes. The detective went back to Alex, who said Nick never mentioned any family issues aside from saying his dad was hard on him. Alex maintained Nick was a nice guy and that Nick never talked about any guys and never saw Nick with any guns. At this point, the detective stuck with the harsh dad narrative to get more information out of Nick. Nick revealed that he and his dad had issues, but his dad wasn't necessarily hard on him. He admitted to being caught drinking a couple of times. The detective alerted Nick that Ryan mentioned Nick called his brothers. Nick admitted to this, which is huge because he previously stated he never spoke to his brothers or any of his family in general the night before. Nick added that around 9 or 10 p.m. that night, he called his brother Greg and told him to leave the back door unlocked because he planned to go inside and grab the keys. This didn't align at all with Nick's feigned surprise realize that the back door being unlocked and exposes Nick's continual lying. When the interrogator asked Nick if he had any suspicions about who could have done this to his family, Nick mentioned a neighbor, Bobby, who was rumored to be a drug addict that had numerous run-ins with the cops. Nick was clearly trying to take the suspicion away from himself and move it to another party. If Nick really killed his family, why? The interrogator went back to Alex for more information about Nick's relationship with his family. Alex dropped some bombshells. He revealed that Nick said his little brothers were annoying, that his mother drank a lot, and that Nick called his father Calling anyone, especially a parent, is a huge red flag. What did Nick's father do to make Nick compare him to one of the most evil men in history? After all of this, Alex, Ryan, and Taylor are allowed to leave. Nick was kept behind. The detective let Nick know his friends were gone, and he seemed even more relaxed by that point, asking for food and something to drink. The detective brought him a burger, fries, and a soda. Nick comfortably sat and ate, completely unbothered and unfazed by how everything was going. After he finished his food, he even kicked off his shoes and put his feet up. Most people wouldn't have an appetite after their family was murdered, but hey, gotta eat sometime, right? Nick didn't seem to care about their deaths at all. Over 25 minutes later, two other detectives, let's call them D2 and D3, came in and basically played the bad cops. They weren't nearly as nice and friendly as the first detective. D2 and D3 acted very accusatory towards Nick. D2 lied and told Nick that the other boys said Nick's father was unusually mean and livid towards Nick the night before the murder. This is a tactic meant to convince Nick that his friend turned on him, so he has to tell the truth. At this point, Nick had lost the calm, cool, and collected vibe he had before. His voice softened and he fidgeted more. Nick said when he got dropped off at Ryan's, his father checked and made sure Ryan's parents were really home. Nick insisted that his dad wasn't mean to him that evening. Nick added that his friends never actually saw his dad when he got dropped off, so they couldn't have seen his dad being mean. After that, D3 flat out told Nick he believes he was involved in the crime. Nick fell silent. D3 further implied that if Nick confessed, he might have a lesser punishment. On the other hand, if he continued to lie, the punishment would be more severe. D2 repeatedly told Nick that they needed to know why he did it and what happened. In efforts to guilt Nick and soften him up, D3 showed Nick a family photo. Nick wasn't moved in the slightest. D2 told Nick that no one broke into the house. Nick insisted he didn't kill his family, while D2 and D3 insisted he did. This was where Nick slowly started to break down. Both detectives used another tactic to get Nick to confess. They told Nick that the police found the gun locker's keys in Nick's room under his mattress. D3 reminded Nick that he called Greg and told him to leave the back door open. Nick maintained his innocence, repeatedly saying he didn't kill his family. D3 said a 9mm was missing, and both detectives continued to tell Nick he killed them. D3 switched gears and asked Nick why he called his dad. Nick tried to make light of it, saying his dad was just strict and that it was a joke between them, adding that his mother even called him sometimes. I don't think you can normalize calling someone Hitler a little joke. That came from a deeper place, maybe hatred. Nick continued to insist that he didn't kill his parents and that he loved his family and that his parents gave him everything he wanted. Nick wasn't very convincing as he said it. D3 insisted that Nick was the killer and that the reason why he killed him was because of his father's strictness. Nick asked the detectives that if he killed his family, why would he put the keys under his mattress? If Nick cared so much about his family's death, he would be cooperating with police, not continually deflecting and asking the same question 1,000 times. D2 responded to Nick, saying Nick put those keys there because he didn't think the house would be searched. Both D2 and D3 also explained that they'd been working in their field for years and understood how different criminals worked, especially burglars. Both D2 and D3 made a note of saying that burglars never murdered their victims, only stole things. D2 then switched up and tried to lower Nick's defenses by saying the murder was a mistake, basically normalizing the situation so Nick would be more inclined to confess. I gotta hand it to the feds. They sure know how to manipulate. D3 reminded Nick of how his parents were supposed to pick him up that morning to go and clean the house, yet he went to the mall with his friends. D2 added that Nick knew he didn't have to go home, assuming Nick killed his family. Nick responded saying he simply didn't want to go home and wanted to go to the mall instead to avoid cleaning the house. He added that he called and left messages so they wouldn't get mad at him. Nick's reason for calling his family changed. Before, he said he called them out of worry because nobody had come to pick him up. Now he said he called them so they wouldn't get mad at him for going to the mall. It seemed like Nick was panicking and could no longer keep his story straight. Nick insisted that his parents weren't that strict and didn't even ground him for the times he got caught drinking, and repeatedly insisted he was innocent. Nick and the two detectives went back and forth about his innocence. D3 repeated the story that he believed Nick was trying to tell, which was that a burglar broke in, found the keys to the gun locker, opened the locker, took the 9mm and killed the whole family. D3 also asked Nick if he expected them to believe such a story. This next part Nick started to tell on himself a little more, I mean. Nick interrupted D2, saying he knew the burglar didn't find the keys and open the gun locker. Nick added that there were multiple sets of keys and that he didn't put them under his mattress. D2 insisted he did. Nick said the gun was already out and that he didn't need the gun locker keys, adding that it wouldn't make sense for him to grab the keys. If Nick didn't do it and wasn't there, how did he know the gun was already out? Further, why did he refer to himself as not needing the keys instead of saying the burglar didn't need the keys? After more back and forth, D2 and D3 left Nick alone in the room. 10 minutes later, they returned. D3 asked Nick about the keys in his jacket pocket. Nick admitted they were in his pocket and hadn't realized he had the keys until the morning. D3 pointed out Nick had lied once again and asked him why he killed his family. Nick insisted he didn't. Nick asked if he's going to jail over the gun locker keys, and the two detectives didn't give him a straight answer. Nick and the detectives went back and forth some more before Nick asked how they were so sure he was the culprit, all the while continuing to insist he was innocent. D2 and D3 told Nick the reason he was gone from Ryan's house so long was because he needed time to come up with a story to tell. D2 reminded Nick that he stated all the lights were on. Nick decided to change his story and said it was only his parents' bedroom lights. Like I said, Nick was starting to panic here and couldn't keep his story straight. The detective's tactics were starting to break him down. Nick told the two detectives that he didn't have to convince them of his innocence. D2 and D3 insisted that he did and told him he was being arrested for 4 counts of first-degree murder. D3 handcuffed Nick to a pipe nearby, then both detectives left the room. This was another tactic meant to scare Nick into confessing soon. Nick was left alone for 40 minutes and wound up falling asleep in that time. Trying to keep up with all the lies he was telling must have been exhausting. Nick either didn't understand or simply didn't care about the severity of his situation. The original detective, who was playing the friendly guy, returned and uncuffed Nick. The detective confronted Nick about his lie, referencing the lights in the house. Nick laughed slightly about this and said he knew for sure that his parents' bedroom light was on. The detective reminded Nick that they needed a reason for why he did it. Nick's response to this was very telling. Nick said that even with a reason, he would still go to jail. Clearly, Nick was more concerned about what would happen to him and wasn't at all concerned about having just lost his family. The detective repeated what D3 said before and implied that Nick's reasoning could be the difference between a light punishment and a more severe punishment. The detective also used phrases like cold-blooded killer and person who made a mistake, a tactic to get Nick to confess by identifying with the nicer sounding phrase. Additionally, the detective tried to play up the hurt child angle due to Nick's treatment by his father. Nick remained defensive and insisted that he was innocent. He added that the keys didn't mean anything. He assumed that the keys might be more important to the officers with all their experience, but they wouldn't mean much to a jury. The detective seized that moment to point out how Nick was already planning how to play the jury. Nick pivoted and asked how an explanation or reason would affect his jail time. Nick seemed to have realized that he wasn't getting out of this and was subtly trying to see what his options were regarding his sentencing. I don't think a truly innocent guy would be so concerned about himself and the time he's facing after what's occurred. Nick didn't believe that confessing and giving an explanation would lower the severity of his punishment. After some more back and forth, Nick continued to insist that a burglary caused his family's death. The detective took that moment to ask an important question. If a burglary took place, why would the burglar kill the family and not take anything? Nick's response was pretty poor. He said that maybe the burglar freaked out after the murder and left, adding that anyone could get freaked out after doing such a thing. He obviously knew from experience. If this whole interrogation was chess, this next part is where the detective could call check. The detective told Nick that the whole thing was staged to look like a burglary. Nick's entire demeanor changed and he got quiet again. After a few moments, Nick asked the detective how he knew it was staged and how he knew whether or not things were missing. The detective told Nick about his expertise in the field and they went back and forth some more and debated Nick's innocence. Nick mentioned the possibility of serving life in a mental institution as opposed to going to jail and actually brought it up a few times. The detective never gave a clear answer on whether or not it was a possibility for him. It seemed like Nick was alluding to confessing if life in medical custody was on the table. Gotta find the silver lining, right? The detective eventually told Nick that they had enough evidence to convict him and that he needed a reason for the crime to see about a more lenient punishment. Nick argued that there wasn't a reason. The detective continued to tell Nick how serious his situation was, adding that he knew Nick was a good kid with a good reason for what he did. For some extra razzle-dazzle, the detective assured Nick he only wanted to help, that he knew Nick didn't plan it and did everything because of how his dad treated him. Nick visibly started to break down and showed emotion. Going back to my chess reference, this was the checkmate. Nick admitted to the detective that he did kill his family and it was because of his father. Nick said his father physically abused him. The example Nick gave was when Nick's dad was taking him to a leadership camp that Nick's Boy Scouts group had put together. Nick said he had an attitude on the way to the camp and that his father got angry and hit him. Nick also cited mental abuse, saying his father sometimes called him a up. Nick said things started getting really intense that previous fall. Nick brought up how one time he had gotten caught taking out the car and his dad threatened to take it away. He further mentioned how his father got angry over a D he'd received, even though he made it up later and got a higher grade. Nick revealed that his father had hit him on more than one occasion and would even yell at him in front of his friends. Nick also mentioned that his father had been strict since he was in first grade and that it seemed like the older he got, the stricter his father became. He added that his father was angry with him at the night he got dropped off at Ryan's. Finally, Nick spoke about the murder. Nick said when he went back to his house, he saw his father sleeping on the couch and knew the gun was on the workbench. Nick grabbed the gun and sat for about half an hour, presumably thinking of his next move. He eventually went and stood over his father and aimed the gun at his head. He moved the gun back and forth, torn between what to do. Nick said he didn't know if he meant to pull the trigger, but he did. Nick said the gun made a loud ringing sound and he waited a few minutes to see if his mother and brothers would wake up and come rushing down. They never did. He went upstairs to his parents' bedroom and shot his sleeping mother in the head. Then he moved to his brother's room and shot them both in the head as well. They were also asleep. The detectives asked why he shot his brothers. Nick replied, saying they wouldn't have been able to help him maintain the story he made up and it scared him. The detective also asked why he shot them all in the head. Nick replied, saying he thought it would be a faster death. Wow. How considerate of him. The detective asked Nick where the gun was, and Nick told him. Nick also agreed to go physically show the police where he stashed the gun. After that, the detective officially charged Nick with 4 counts of first-degree murder. After trial started, Nick's other family members, including his grandfather, sent letters to the judge asking for leniency for Nick. Nick's grandfather backed up Nick's account of physical and mental abuse by his father. Nick took a plea deal in January of 2009 where he pled guilty to all 4 counts and was sentenced to 4 life terms in prison, 2 of which would be served consecutively. 4 life terms is wild to process. Nick will be eligible for parole in 2031 after serving 23 years. Nick's story reminds me of a similar case regarding 8-year-old Maddie Clifton, who was murdered by 14-year-old Josh Phillips. Here's the brief background. On November 3rd, 1998, Maddie went missing in Jacksonville, Florida. Police were notified, conducted interviews with neighbors, and began searching. Hundreds of people volunteered and helped search for Maddie, but none of them found her. 14-year-old Josh Phillips' mother, Melissa Phillips, found her. Melissa went in Josh's room and thought his waterbed was leaking. When she went to check, she discovered Maddie's body hidden underneath. She immediately called the police. When Melissa found out Josh was at school, police arrested him there. Josh had no history of violence, and no one could believe he was capable of something so terrible. Josh confessed to the police that he did in fact murder Maddie, but that it was an accident. Josh explained that he and Maddie had been playing and he had accidentally hit Maddie in the head with a baseball. Josh then carried Maddie into his house, into his room, and laid her on the floor, but she started crying and making noise. Josh said he grew afraid of how his father would react to come home and find Maddie in the house. From that growing fear and panic, Josh beat Maddie with a baseball bat and stabbed her to keep her from screaming and crying. Then he hid her under his bed. With this case, there were a few things I just didn't understand. If Josh knew his father hated other children being in the house, why did he carry her in rather than finding an adult nearby? Also, when Maddie began to make noise, rather than trying to soothe and comfort her, why was his first idea to beat her to death to quiet her down? At 14 years old, I'd assume you'd have enough logic to understand that killing isn't the solution to quiet a child in pain and distress. Sources explained that Josh's father, Steve Phillips, was a drug addict and alcoholic, didn't like having other children in the house, and had a tendency to be violent towards Josh and Melissa. This explained his fear of consequences, but didn't explain him beating a little girl to death. Ultimately, Josh, at 15, was charged with first-degree murder and was tried as an adult. On August 20th, 1999, Josh was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Josh is very similar to Nick in that they both had abusive fathers and committed murders from fear and panic. However, Josh at least showed some remorse and regret. Either way you look at it, the story is incredibly tragic, and a little girl's life was taken much too soon. Another case similar to Nick's took place in Elkmont, Alabama, where a 14-year-old boy confessed to shooting and killing his family, which included his father, stepmother, his younger sister, and 2 younger brothers. The boy, who was never identified, had called the police saying he heard gunshots while he was in the basement. When the police arrived, the boy said he ran out of the house as soon as he heard the gunshots. Upon deeper investigation, though, the boy's story didn't add up. Ultimately, the boy confessed to killing his family with a 9mm handgun. The boy helped investigators find the handgun, which he tossed after the murders. This young boy, like Nick, killed his family and initially feigned innocence. I bet the detective used similar tactics to what was used on Nick to get this boy to confess. Regardless, still a disturbing case. Consider another case like Nick's. In New Jersey, just before New Year's in 2017, 16-year-old Scott Kalogi shot and killed 4 of his family members with a semi-automatic assault rifle. At a family party on New Year's Eve 2016, Scott killed his sister Brittany, mother Linda, father Stephen, and his grandfather's companion Mary Schultz. Scott's defense attorneys claimed he was mentally ill and his illness caused him to commit the murders. During testimony at the trial, it was revealed that Scott's mother Linda didn't want him telling his therapist how he thought about killing people because she was afraid that he would be hospitalized. It was also noted that Scott pulled the trigger 14 times, 12 of which hit the victims. Prosecutors stressed that Scott was well aware of what he was doing and wanted to kill them. They also mentioned that Scott planned these murders. Apparently, Scott researched if his weapon would be effective against police wearing bulletproof vests. He wore earplugs to muffle the sounds of the gunshots and lured Linda upstairs to shoot her. When Scott's father, Stephen, rushed in to see what happened, Scott shot and killed him too. After that, Scott went downstairs and murdered his sister Brittany and grandfather's companion Mary. Scott's brother and grandfather were also home, but they were unharmed. Carol Kalogi, Stephen's mother, asked the judge to send Scott somewhere he could get help for his mental illness. Ultimately, Scott was sentenced to 150 years in prison and must serve at least 85% of it, which is the equivalent of 127 and a half. In this case, it's a bit hard to determine if mental illness is truly the reason for Scott's actions. Granted, Scott allegedly told his mother previous times that he thought about killing people. There's no proof other than hearsay. The whole case is horrifying from beginning to end, either way you slice it. Here's one more case that is really comparable to Nick's cases and other cases of teen serial killers. In Tulsa, Oklahoma in 2015, teen brothers Michael, 16, and Robert Bever, 18, killed their family, including the mother April, father Daniel, 2 younger brothers Daniel and Christopher, and 5-year-old sister Victoria. 2 other sisters survived, luckily. The mother, father, brothers, and sister all died of a combined more than 100 sharp force wounds, which were suspected to be from knives and a hatchet. April, the mother, tried to fight back and was stabbed almost 50 times. Authorities never revealed Michael and Robert's motives. However, neighbors said all of the kids were homeschooled and weren't allowed to socialize with the neighbors or play with kids outside the family. After the attack, Robert told police that his parents abused them, citing instances where his father dragged him upstairs for leaving a light on and his mother slapped him so hard it left a mark. This led to Robert revealing how he planned the murder and hoped he'd get famous for killing them. This guy must have thought trying to make it as an actor or singer was for losers. Defense attorneys for Michael said he was led astray by his older brother, and Robert requested to take full responsibility for all of the murders. Ultimately, Robert was sentenced to life in prison without parole, while Michael was convicted for 5 counts of first-degree murder plus 28 years for assault on their 13-year-old sister who survived the attack. For Michael, this adds up to 253 years, and by Oklahoma law, he's expected to serve at least 85% of them before he reaches parole eligibility. There certainly are a lot of commonalities between the teens who commit these mass murders of their families. The recurring theme in terms of motive is some sort of abuse and/or mental illness. The usual arguments between opposing sides are either cold killer, scared and abused kid who made a mistake, or mentally ill. Sometimes there's a blend of the last two. What do you think? Wild story about Nicholas Browning, right? Do you think Nick was justified in what he did? Did Nick deserve a lesser penalty since he was allegedly abused and scared? Was Nick really a good kid who made a mistake? Do you think his punishment fits his crime? Do you want us to go into more detail about the other cases mentioned in this episode? The Josh Phillips case, the Alabama case, the Scott Kalogi case, or the Bever brothers case? Please let us know any and all of your thoughts in the comments down below. I'm Allie, and thanks for watching Killer Bites.
Have you ever heard of the term nature versus nurture? Maybe in biology class or sociology class? Well, buckle up, because today's case sparked national debate over what many consider to be one of the most highly controversial sociological issues of all time. Hello, I'm Mac, and welcome to another episode of Killer Bites. So if you're unfamiliar, nature versus nurture is a long-standing debate in society and biology between factors that determine a human's fate. Is it our genetics that determine our fate? The coded DNA that we're born with and unable to change? Or is it our environment? The people, places, and general environment that we are around on a daily basis that determines our fate? To begin, let's focus on this tragic story that spans 3 generations. Familiar situations that end each in familiar fashion. A man bearing the name Weaver going to prison for murder. It was January 9th, 2002 in Oregon City when 12-year-old Ashley Pond disappeared. It was like any other chilly morning in Oregon as the bus made all of its usual stops. Ashley knew her bus route well. It was 10 minutes away from the apartment complex where she lived with her mother, but she never made it on the bus that morning. That night, her mother grew concerned when Ashley hadn't come home. She called Ashley's school and discovered that she had never arrived at school. Investigators searched high and low with minimal leads. Ashley was popular at school, was on the swim team and on the dance teams. Her mother was adamant that she did not run away. For 2 months, locals weren't sure what happened to Ashley. Was this another case of a rebellious teen looking to get away from their parents? Or had something much more nefarious happened? It wasn't clear until 2 months later when another girl from the same apartment complex went missing on her way to the same bus stop. Miranda Gaddis, a 13-year-old friend of Ashley Pond's, was never seen again. Investigators quickly realized that the two missing girls were connected in age, looks, and location. They began talking with neighbors and stumbled upon one with a complicated family history. April 6, 1963, Ward Weaver III was born into an environment of chaos. His father, Ward Weaver Jr., and his mother, Trish Weaver, were already known by the local police for their violent and volatile behavior. The first 4 years of young Ward Weaver's life, as well as the lives of his 3 siblings, were filled with a front row seat to their parents' constant drinking, use, and abusive fights. Trish Weaver left Jr. in 1967, citing the abuse in their relationship. While Jr. would occasionally see his children, he was soon drafted to the war in Vietnam, which would cause his visits to become even more sporadic and rare over the years. Trish would then remarry, attempting to give her children a more stable situation. Instead, by marrying Bob Boudreau, she introduced them to a similar situation of chaos and in turn changed Ward Weaver III forever. Moving to Eureka, California with her mother, the children were beaten regularly by Bob. He was a man who could become enraged at the smallest slight and drank so heavily during his marriage to Trish that she would regularly pack the kids in the car late at night and drive from bar to bar looking for her husband. Growing up in an abusive household, Ward still found ways to remain intrepid and childlike. He loved John Wayne movies and didn't complain when his Christmas gifts consisted of underwear and socks. It wasn't until a solo trip with Bob at the age of 12 that Ward's behavior and relationship with his mother took a serious turn. Bob was working as a longshoreman, someone who loads and unloads ships at port. He had a job a couple hours away in Sacramento, California, that would take weeks to complete. Trying to introduce Ward to the responsibilities of work, Trish agreed that he should travel with Bob. However, weeks later, Trish received a phone call from another dock worker informing her that Bob had been leaving Ward alone in a motel for hours on end as he bar hopped all day and night. Furious, she insisted that Bob and Ward return home. When they did, Trish claims that Ward was never the same. "That's the day I lost my son," Trish said. She would continue to blame that trip and Bob Boudreau's treatment of Ward for the change and development of Ward's uncontrollable rage. The family would move to Portland, Oregon for work, and Ward spent his high school time rebelling. He listened to AC/DC, smoked, and made his younger siblings' lives miserable. Ward would regularly find ways to torture his younger brother and sister. He would tie his half-brother Robert to a tree by a chain-link fence, separating their yard from a neighbor with an aggressive dog. Robert would be inches away from the jaws of an angry, snapping dog as Ward laughed and enjoyed the torment. Ward had a BB gun and would shoot his younger sister Tammy in the back. He found amusement in leaving large welts on the much younger girl's skin. Graduating from high school 6 months early, Ward eventually joined the U.S. Navy Reserve in 1981. Several months later, Ward received orders to ship out to the Philippines with the Navy as a cook. Not long after he left, a relative of Ward's came forward and accused Ward of raping her. However, after authorities questioned Ward and the girl, they deemed the investigation useless to pursue, given Ward's departure for a foreign country. This would begin an incredibly frustrating trend in Ward's life where a police investigation into an accusation would not be taken seriously. Ward returned from the Philippines a little over a year later after a less than honorable discharge. He returned to America with a woman, Maria Stout. They quickly moved to the Portland area and lived in the basement of Trish Weaver and Bob Boudreau. Ward's behavior continued to be unpredictable as he married Maria, and in the early years of the relationship, Maria was hospitalized after telling police that Ward had slapped her, pulled her hair, and banged her head on their bedposts. Yikes. While in the hospital, Ward's own mother, Trish, begged for Maria to press charges. Trish later stated, "I kept hoping someone would listen, someone would realize there was something wrong with this guy, someone would pick up the ball and do something." Maria would never press charges. It was during that same year that Ward's biological father, Ward Weaver Jr., had his most violent incident to date. Jr. was sentenced to death for the murders of 23-year-old Robert Radford and 18-year-old Barbara Lavoie. He had been high on and stimulant, which was most commonly used in World War II to prevent fatigue in soldiers. He picked up Robert and Barbara as hitchhikers before beating Robert with a lead pipe, raping Barbara over the course of multiple days on the road, and eventually strangling Barbara to death. Perhaps the most troubling fact about the murders was Junior's attempt to hide Barbara's body. Returning home to Oroville, California with her body, he began digging a hole with his 10-year-old son and Ward III's half-brother. He told the boy they were digging to look for a broken sewer pipe. However, once the boy went to school, Junior put Barbara's body in the hole, filled it with concrete, and built a wooden porch on top of it. After his father's trial, Weaver III was frustrated that he had not been asked to speak as a character witness. He stated, "If I had been given the chance to speak on his behalf, I gladly would have. I love my father a lot and do not want him to be executed." During the investigation and trial for the murders, the scope of Junior's violent tendencies became very clear. This was an unpredictable and aggressive man who had been this way ever since he was a child. His defense team told stories of his own volatile upbringing. His father, Ward Weaver Sr., would regularly sexually assault his wife and other women he would bring home. Sr. would also rape his own daughter, as well as molest 2 of Junior's daughters. Junior's mother, Dorothy, regularly took nerve pills and would beat him with a belt. She told him that men should be castrated and forced him to sleep in the same bed as her until he was the age of 18. This included his wedding night. After his father's death sentence, Ward moved his family to Bakersfield in an attempt to reconnect with Junior. He would later tell authorities that we caught up on a lot of lost time. During the same time, his marriage to Maria continued to deteriorate and fall on hard times financially. With their son, Francis Weaver, the couple was taken in by family friends, the Ordonas. The Ordonas sold Filipino products at a weekly farmer's market, and Ward's experience in the Philippines came in handy, helping collect peanuts and desserts in the family van. While the Ordonas were aware of the couple's fighting, they offered a space in their home until the Weavers got back on their feet. After another night of heavy drinking, Ward was picked up by Jennifer Ordonas and her 15-year-old sister. Ward asked them to pull over for him to go to the bathroom, and afterwards hit Jennifer over the head with a cement block. Jennifer would later testify that Ward had a cold and neutral demeanor, as if he was sleepwalking through his violent actions, completely unaffected, possessed almost. Ward would be sentenced to 3 years in prison for the assault and would tell his probation officer that ultimately his biggest fear was ending up just like his father. When Ward was released from prison in 1988, those close to him hoped he would turn a new leaf to distance himself from his father's troubled past. Instead, the next 5 years were filled with continued domestic disputes with Maria, evictions, distribution of, and ultimately a restraining order from his wife. By 2001, Ward Weaver III was in a new relationship, living in a rental home in Oregon City with his youngest daughter, Mallory. It appeared that he had grown from his years of trouble. He was a member of the community and regularly hosted sleepovers for his daughter and her friends. Mallory went to Gardner Middle School and took the bus off of South Beaver Creek Road, where she would quickly befriend 2 other classmates, Ashley Pond and Miranda Gaddis. Ashley Pond was forced to grow up early. She was a rebellious child with a snarky attitude, and as more facts about her upbringing emerged, none could blame her. She lived with her mother in an apartment complex that was known to house unsavory characters. The complex was where the county frequently placed mentally ill and unstable patients for short-term housing, which would lead to a plethora of potential suspects. When officers first heard from Ashley's mother that she was missing, their first reaction was that the soon-to-be teenager was acting out, run away from home for attention, skipping school as kids sometimes do. Ashley's mother was adamant that that was not what happened. She had been excited for a dance recital that night. None of her clothes or belongings were missing from her bedroom. It wasn't until a week without any contact from Ashley that the reality began to hit investigators. Ashley Pond had been abducted. The investigation quickly came back with a jarring discovery: a death of potential suspects, not just within the town, but within a 1-mile radius of Ashley's route from the apartment to her bus stop. One of the suspects was her own father, who had been convicted of sexually assaulting Ashley during one of her visits. In fact, there was over 90 registered sex offenders living within the 1-mile area of town near Ashley. Time out, hold on. 90 offenders? That is shocking and terrifying, but it really puts into perspective how dangerous that 10-minute walk to the bus every morning could become. The town's police department was overwhelmed with possibilities and underwhelmed by the evidence. There was no sign of Ashley, nothing left behind, and no signs of where she went. For months, the town stayed optimistic that perhaps she really had run away. It wasn't until 2 months later that it became very clear that Oregon City had a very serious problem. Miranda Gaddis had a similar story to Ashley Pond, and that wasn't where the similarities ended. Like Ashley, Miranda attended the same middle school, lived in the same apartment complex with her mother, had brown hair, brown eyes, and was part of the dance team. The two were friends, spending weekends, having sleepovers, and walking home together frequently. Miranda had even been interviewed in the weeks that followed Ashley's disappearance, saying, "It's really hard to believe that happened to one of your friends or something. It's just really different and really sad." Miranda had also experienced inappropriate behavior early on. Her stepfather had molested her at a young age, and her biological father had also been convicted of sexually assaulting two minors. Investigators now knew that they had someone who was abducting girls and called in over 60 FBI officials to assist with the case. The lack of evidence continued to confound those who worked the case. How were these two girls that were so well known in town able to just completely disappear off the map without a trace? A theory began to prevail. Ashley Pond and Miranda Gaddis must have known their abductor to not have put up any kind of struggle. As family members grew frustrated with the lack of progress in the case, they became intimately involved in the investigation. An extended family member of Ashley Pond's family, Linda O'Neill, began to do her own investigation. A licensed private investigator, Linda, was called to action saying, "Well, the FBI would say, we have no suspects, we have no crime scene, and we have no clues." So it appeared that they needed a little help. Linda shared the FBI's belief that Ashley and Miranda knew their attacker and asked around town where the girls liked to hang out. It was then that she unearthed a police complaint from a year before. Concerned, Linda began to do more digging on male members of the community that Ashley and Miranda had interacted with. Linda researched their neighbor, Ward Weaver, and quickly discovered he was on death row. Confused, she realized that it was Ward Weaver Jr. and that the Ward Weaver in Oregon City was the son of a convicted murderer. But certainly a father's misdeeds weren't enough to make someone a suspect. This was someone who frequently hosted sleepovers and who had even taken Ashley Pond in and let her live with the family during one of her mother's most tumultuous times. It was then that Linda discovered a police report from August of 2001 where Ashley Pond told authorities that while having a sleepover at Mallory Weaver's house, Ward Weaver had sexually molested her. Police would say that they investigated those claims, but no charges were ever filed. Okay, this is absolutely infuriating. I'm not even related to any of these victims, and I can't even handle seeing all the missteps that at the hands of the police. I can only imagine how their families felt. Investigators had been through the Weavers' neighborhood with dogs to see if there was any trace of Ashley or Miranda. Even going to Ward's residence specifically, the dogs picked up nothing. Linda continued to research Ward, interviewing his past wives and girlfriends, his daughter's friends, and anyone who had something to say about him. There was the teacher who saw Ward drop off Ashley and pull her in for a passionate kiss on the lips. There was a family friend who alleged that Ashley would sleep in Ward's bed with him anytime she slept over. And finally, there was an ex-girlfriend of Ward's who told Linda O'Neill that he was angry with Miranda Gaddis because she had been telling other girls in the neighborhood to avoid the Weaver house because of his inappropriate behavior. Linda combed through past news reports and even found a quote that Ward had given a paper on his thoughts about Ashley's disappearance, saying, "That little girl took off," and I wholeheartedly believe that. The case was starting to get national attention. Two missing girls from the same neighborhood, no evidence or leads. The town was held hostage by fear. The bus route was switched to pick up children from their individual homes to ensure no child walked alone. Parents grew paranoid. More and more investigators flocked to Oregon City to try and assist the FBI, much to the annoyance of the police. One of these private investigators was Harry Oakes. Oakes knew his reputation within police departments. He was known as a pest who the authorities hated to work with. Oakes owned a for-profit search and rescue center using his own sniffing dogs on cases. Oakes came to town on his own accord, waiving his fee and hoping to find out what happened to these innocent girls. With the help of one of his dogs and a piece of Ashley's clothing, Oakes stumbled upon a series of unusual clues. Starting at the apartment complex, the dog had Ashley's scent. It led Oakes down the path to the bus stop until finally up to Ward Weaver III's house. Unsure how he would react, Oakes knocked on Weaver's door and asked if his dog could sniff the property. Weaver's demeanor was one of someone who had nothing to hide. He told Oakes that the authorities had already brought 7 different search teams through the property and found nothing. Oakes entered the property with the dog, who still had the scent of Ashley Pond. The dog alerted Oakes that her scent was in the hallway before heading outside. Outside, Oakes noticed a fresh concrete slab in the backyard. The dog quickly headed that way. Oakes would later say, "Where the slab met with the grass, the dirt where they came together, my dog was smelling Ashley's scent coming out of there." Right. Because nothing says innocent like a fresh slab of cement in your yard when 2 girls have gone missing. Oakes thanked Weaver for his time and quickly filed a report to the Oregon City Police Department and FBI investigators. It was March 20th, 2002, 2 weeks after Miranda had disappeared, His independent findings and report were completely ignored by the authorities. It was then that Linda O'Neill, looking for a way to officially connect Ward Weaver's to the disappearances, came across Harry Oakes' report. One bit stood out the most from his investigation: the freshly laid slab of concrete. Through her research into Ward Weaver and his father on death row, an important part of the early 1980s investigation was hard to forget. When Junior had forced his 10-year-old son to help him dig a hole where he would bury a woman's body before covering her with a concrete slab and building a porch over her remains, Linda was disturbed by the similarities. Was Ward Weaver III mimicking his own father's attempt to hide the body of an innocent woman he had murdered in cold blood? By June of 2002, the investigation continued to gain notoriety. The story was featured in People magazine, and the authorities didn't seem to have a prime suspect, but rather a range of unsavory characters that could potentially fit the bill as the culprit. It was then, after months of investigating Ward, that Linda O'Neill met him face to face. Linda returned home to her son working on his car in the driveway with a strange man standing next to him. Linda quickly realized that this was Ward Weaver III. Uncomfortable with his presence, Linda attempted to bring her son inside with her. It was then that Ward turned to Linda and said, "Kids are so naive, aren't they?" To which Linda responded, "Mr. Weaver, I don't think my family is any of your business." Ward thought for a moment before responding, "Miss O'Neill, that's what I came here to tell you." From then on, Linda O'Neill would carry a loaded gun in her purse, and honestly, you can't really blame her, because that is super creepy. It was after this incident and growing frustrated at the FBI's lack of interest in Ward as a suspect that Linda called the Portland Tribune and got in contact with reporter Jim Redden. Jim would interview Ward at his house, giving him a chance to clear his name. Jim would later state that he really seemed like a very normal kind of guy. He was coming across to me as sort of honest and candid. The more he talked, the more nervous he got, and that's when he said, "I'm the FBI's prime suspect." The interview with the Portland Tribune would be the first time that the general public would hear the name Ward Weaver III, especially as the self-proclaimed prime suspect in the case. Other reporters descended on Oregon City to interview Ward. He took them interview after interview, showing different reporters the grounds around his house and arguing that the only reason he was a suspect was because his father's crimes over 2 decades earlier. Ward would defend his actions with Ashley by saying he was only trying to help her out of the difficult family situation that she was in. He even added, she's better off hiding out wherever she's found a place to live. Weeks later, the FBI conducted a huge raid on a suspect in the case, but it wasn't Ward. It was a neighbor of both girls who had his own checkered past and failed the polygraph test. A search warrant was executed as investigators sifted through his home, his car, and all of his personal belongings. No additional evidence was found. Linda was adamant about the FBI was wasting time by looking at suspects other than Ward Weaver III. By August of 2002, 7 months after Ashley Pond's disappearance, Ward grew restless. The rumors swirling around town were hurting his reputation, and the media attention was grueling. He began to tell friends and family that he would be leaving Oregon City either for Idaho or Mexico. He packed up his home and all of his belongings, ready to move. That was until the rage he had been able to keep hidden from the world for the last 15 years returned. Ward's son from his first marriage to Maria Stout, Francis, was now 19 years old. He was local to Oregon City and occasionally stayed with his father. Francis would bring his girlfriend Randy Oneida and their young child with them as well. Randy was friendly with Ward, familiar with him. It wasn't until August 13, 2002 that everything had changed. Ward was driving Randy back to his house, which was mostly empty and packed up. Recalling the incident, Randy would mention it wasn't until they got inside that he was possessed. It wasn't him. It looked like Satan was inside of him. But the second he stood up off of me, his face went back to normal. Ward forced himself on his son's girlfriend, ripping off her clothes and raping her. She would eventually get him off of her and run out of the house naked. Able to flag down a car nearby, she was safe. Within hours of the attack, Ward Weaver III was arrested, booked, and in jail. While Ward sat in a jail cell, Francis came to the authorities with more information about his father. Francis told him that Ward had confessed to killing both Ashley Pond and Miranda Gaddis. 10 days later, with a search warrant in hand, the authorities were able to search the Weaver property and dig up the cement that had been there since the early spring. They would find the body of Ashley Pond underneath the cement and the remains of Miranda Gaddis in a cardboard box in Ward's shed. Ward Weaver III had indeed disposed of Ashley's body the same way his father, Ward Weaver Jr., had done with Robert Radford and Barbara Lavoie 20 years earlier. There was outrage from the Oregon City residents that it had taken so long to search the property. And this outrage was very much deserved. You had an accusation from one of the missing girls, past crimes, and a suspicious fresh patch of concrete outside the house. In particular, Linda O'Neill's information was brought to light again. The FBI's special agent in charge said that there was only one documented conversation between Laura O'Neill and the FBI. He said the tip was a psychic tip, and that is the only documented contact this investigation had with the author. Ward Weaver III was indicted and charged with 6 counts of aggravated murder and various counts of rape and sexual abuse. One can only reflect on what Ward told his probation officer in 1988 as he was released from prison, that his biggest fear was ending up on death row like his father, Ward Weaver Jr. What went so wrong in the 15 years since then that he had now faced the exact same predicament, with a case that shared so many of the same details? Perhaps it was the thought of ending up on death row just like his father that convinced Ward to stop proclaiming himself innocent and instead accept a plea bargain. Ward Weaver III would plead guilty to 2 charges and no contest to the rest in order to avoid the death penalty. Instead, he was given 2 life sentences in prison without parole. After having his father arrested for the rape of his girlfriend, Francis Weaver was clearly affected by his family's long lists of atrocities. It was through DNA testing related to Ashley Pond and Miranda Gaddis's murder that Francis received more shocking news. He was not Ward Weaver III's biological son. Both Francis and Ward were under the impression that they were father and son, but the DNA proved that Francis had a different father. Francis's mother, Maria Stout, would later say that she could not be sure who his father was, but it was most likely between a deceased Marine or a Navy officer she had met years before. Francis was 19 years old when his father went to prison. Having already grown up around his incredibly volatile temper and the knowledge that his grandfather was a convicted murderer on death row, suddenly Francis knew nothing. If he wasn't a Weaver by blood, would he still be cursed to make the same mistakes as his father and his father's father? By 2002, Francis had already had a checkered past of his own with the law. And in 1999, he had been charged with aggravated assault after shooting a rifle into a truck full of teens, injuring his best friend. He served several weeks in a juvenile detention facility before returning home. Francis continued to rack up his own rap sheet of small crimes, dealing assault, robbery, all before the ages of 25. Things took a turn for the worse in 2014 when Francis Ward was arrested and charged with murder in Canby, Oregon. Reported as a deal gone bad, Francis and 3 others were accused of attempting to rob a man of 15 pounds. Francis was charged with providing the weapon and helping plan the robbery. Francis would be convicted and sentenced to life in prison. However, in September of 2020, the Oregon Supreme Court overturned that murder conviction after discovering that the plea bargain agreement struck with a co-defendant by prosecutors violated Francis Weaver's constitutional rights. Although still in prison, Francis is scheduled for a new trial soon to determine his involvement in the murder. With Francis Weaver behind bars, it put another twist in the lineage of Weaver men with dark pasts. What was it about these men that made them commit such atrocities? Did Ward Weaver III ever have a chance to lead a successful life? Or was he doomed the second he shared the name and DNA of Ward Weaver Jr.? If so, why didn't any of his other siblings fall victim to the same fate? And why would his mother ultimately blame the treatment from his stepfather for his twisted behavior? What would Ward Weaver III's life look like if he had been raised in a more stable situation? What would have been different had investigators decided to pursue charges before Ward Weaver III went to the Philippines to serve in the Navy? Or Ashley Pond's claim months before she was murdered that Ward Weaver III had raped her? Would he have still gone on to hurt more women? One of the remaining mysteries about the Weaver family is if the stories of their murders have finished being written. Ron Schumacher, who prosecuted Ward Weaver Jr. in 1984, would say no. Schumacher now details his conversations with Jr., where he offered in exchange for a plea deal to keep him off death row. He would show investigators the remains of 26 other victims. Although Schumacher declined, adamant that the prosecution should focus on the death penalty, he remains confident that Jr. is connected to dozens of other murders. Jr.'s truck logs from his years of driving match the timelines of numerous missing persons and murders from that time. Now, while Ron Schumacher doesn't believe he is guilty of all of them, the evidence suggests that there are other unsolved cases with his involvement. And after everything that we've learned, it's not hard to believe that Junior could be responsible for a great many number of heinous acts. While it's hard to come up with definitive answers about what is to blame for the Weavers' violent tendencies, what was most interesting to me was it was clear that the explosive home life each grew up with only compounded the issues under the surface. Each boy was forced to experience horrific traumas firsthand and most likely damaged their brain chemistry in the process. Did they already have a predisposition to inflict pain, enjoy torturing other living things, or was that the behavior learned from the men before them? We here at Killer Bites think this story is an important testimonial to the importance of protecting men, women, children, and any of those who need help getting out of these abusive situations. And at this time, we would like to let all of our viewers know that if they know anyone that you believe is being abused, manipulated, hurt, and in danger, that there are resources to help. If you believe that there are children in harm's way, please visit childcare.gov for more information on your specific state's process. If someone you know is in an abusive relationship, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-799-7233. Once again, thanks for watching. I'm Mac, and this is Killer Bites.
It was a story of passion, betrayal, and a relentless quest for revenge that wove a sinister web around Bergen and ultimately led to her untimely demise. At the heart of it all was Hollis Service, Bergen's ex-husband, whose twisted love and jealousy drove him to commit the unthinkable. The chilling events that followed shook the nation to its core, sending shockwaves through the music industry and capturing the world's attention. Bergen Sarvelmeiser was a shining star in Turkey's music scene, her voice captivating audiences across the nation. She was an artist whose music resonated deeply with her fans, bringing joy and inspiration to countless lives. But her life was cut tragically short by an act of senseless violence, leaving a nation to grieve the loss of one of its most cherished talents. On this episode of Killer Bites, we delve into the twisted tale of Bergen's life and death, exploring the dark underbelly of fame and the dangers that lurk beneath its glittering surface. Bergen's childhood was filled with love, laughter, and the company of her 6 older siblings. As the youngest and only girl in the family, she was adored by everyone and enjoyed a carefree life spent playing with her siblings and exploring their neighborhood. Despite their lack of wealth, the family was always happy and content with what they had. However, everything changed when Bergen's parents divorced. The family was split up, and Bergen and her mother moved to Ankara, where Bergen had to start over and make new friends. She enrolled in Yeni Mahal Yunus Emre Primary School, where she discovered her passion for music. Bergen was a natural at singing and could play the mandolin like a pro. Her teachers and classmates were impressed by her talent, and with their support, Bergen continued to practice and grow, building a new life for herself in the world of music. Determined to aim high, Bergen set her sights on the well-known Ankara State Conservatory. The entrance exams were a big challenge, but she was passionate about her music and practiced tirelessly, day and night, to improve her skills. On the day of the exam, her nerves nearly got the better of her, but she held her resolve and delivered a flawless performance that seemed to be spun from the threads of a dream. Bergen was overjoyed when she won first place in the piano department, a significant achievement that opened the door to a new chapter in her life. From that moment on, Bergen dedicated herself to music, pouring her heart and soul into every performance. Bergen's talent blossomed, and she became a rising star in Turkey's music scene. Her unwavering dedication and passion for music drove her to new heights, earning her the admiration and respect of her fans and peers alike. She dove right into the world of piano and cello, and her love for music grew even stronger. She had dreams of a musical career, but they still felt a bit out of reach. Money problems were a harsh reality, and Bergen had to make a tough choice. She left her studies and got a job at the PTT, the Turkish Federal Post Office. There were rumors going around about her getting married in 1977 and having a child, but her family denied those stories. That same year, Bergen's singing talent really started to shine. She went to the Fayman nightclub. It was their favorite place to go out, and one night when she was with her friends, the club's owner, Ilhan Fayman, heard her singing. He offered her a chance to become a singer at his club, and she jumped at the opportunity. Bergen joined the band and sang a mix of Turkish classical music and pop. She was like a magical performer on stage, captivating her audience and quickly becoming a big part of the club's nightlife. Later, she got an offer to sing at the Kuyubaşı Club in Adana, and she took her talent to a new stage. For 8 months, she sang her heart out, lighting up the night with her incredible voice. That's when she met Hollis Service, a man who would change her life forever. Hollis, who was already married with 3 kids, couldn't resist Bergen's charm. He sent her flowers every night and watched her perform at the club. Even though he was married, Bergen was drawn to him, and they started a secret relationship. Hollis wanted to marry Bergen and promised to start a new life with her. She was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed, hoping for a fresh start. Sadly, their marriage turned out to be a lie, and Bergen felt betrayed. She tried to leave Hollis, but he wouldn't let her go. His violent behavior took a heavier and heavier toll on her life, so she had to escape back to Ankara. There, she decided to start over and become a new person. Inspired by the Norwegian city of Bergen, she changed her name and embraced her new identity. She returned to the stage and sang in nightclubs, sharing her talent with the world. As she shared the stage with renowned artists such as Bülent Ersoy, Ibrahim Tatlıses, and Müjde Ar at the Ankara Başkent Casino, Bergen's determination to carve her name into the annals of music history burned like an untamed wildfire. Each performance became an act of catharsis, her heart and soul pouring forth into every note, weaving a tapestry of emotion that ensnared her audience. Bergen's unique voice, an exquisite symphony of power and vulnerability, combined with her magnetic stage presence, transformed her into a celestial beacon that drew people from all corners of Ankara. They gathered like moths to a flame, their hearts ensnared by her enchanting song. Though her dreams had taken flight, the specter of Hollis's violence haunted her still, an unshakable ghost lurking in the recesses of her mind. Amidst the scars of pain and suffering, the fragile tendrils of love for Hollis still clung to the garden of her heart, their roots running deep and entwined with the hope that he could change, that he could blossom into the man she believed he could be. But like a wilted flower, that day never arrived, leaving her to chase a mirage of happiness that ever eluded her grasp. Instead, Bergen found herself ensnared in a never-ending game of cat and mouse, fleeing from the specter of Hollis's fury, seeking solace in the protective embrace of her friends and family. A relentless hunter, Hollis pursued her, his threats of violence echoing like thunder, his venomous words falling like hail upon her fragile spirit. Bergen found herself ensnared in a labyrinth of tangled emotions, yearning to escape Hollis's clutches, and yet feeling powerless to sever the chains that bound her. Bergen found herself stuck in a cycle of love and hate, unable to escape the storm. But things changed when she met Ahmet at the Başkent Casino, where she often performed. Ahmet was kind and gentle, and he was drawn to her incredible voice. Bergen was captivated by Ahmet's warmth, and they became close friends. He was there for her when she needed support, helping her through the ups and downs of her emotions. One day, Ahmet invited Bergen on an adventure away from the city and into the mountains. At first, she hesitated to leave her familiar surroundings, even for a day trip. But Ahmet's encouragement convinced her to take the chance. This guy promised her an unforgettable journey, and deep down, she couldn't resist the call of the adventure. So, together they set off on a trip that would change her life forever. As they traveled through lush forests, crossed sparkling rivers, and climbed towering mountains, Bergen felt a newfound sense of freedom. As the night came to an end, Ahmet and Bergen returned to Ankara, their hearts forever linked by this unforgettable experience. Bergen found someone who truly cared for her in Ahmet and had offered her the promise of a brighter future. When the night drew to a close, Ahmet and Bergen retraced their steps back to Ankara, their hearts now entwined in the tapestry of a shared, unforgettable experience. It was a moment that would forever be etched into the chronicles of their lives. However, the fickle hand of fate dealt Bergen a devastating blow on a fateful night in the city of Izmir. She and her mother stood on the precipice of stepping into a taxi when a shadowy figure emerged, clutching a bucket in his hands. Unable to discern his visage, Bergen felt a cold wave of unease creep over her, like a shroud of mist descending upon the land. As her hand reached out to grasp the taxi door, the stranger hurled the bucket's contents in her direction. A searing, unbearable pain scorched her eyes, and the world around her plunged into a suffocating darkness. The chaotic aftermath was little more than a cacophony of screams and a whirlwind of touches to Bergen as hands reached out in a desperate bid to aid her. Her senses were overwhelmed and her vision shrouded in a black abyss. It felt as though she was drowning in a relentless sea, gasping for breath amidst the turmoil. Bergen Sarrealmeiser's life took a tragic turn when she was brutally attacked with nitric acid, an incident that left her clinging to life. Her injuries were severe and she was rushed to the hospital, where she spent 45 days fighting for her life. Bergen's face and body were horribly burned, and she lost her sight as a result of the attack. The doctors worked tirelessly to save her life, and her mother prayed for her recovery, hoping that Bergen would pull through the ordeal. Her friends, family, and fans rallied around her during her darkest hours, offering their support and encouragement. It was this outpouring of love that kept Bergen going despite the immense physical and emotional trauma she had suffered. As Bergen slowly began to recover from the vicious acid attack, the police launched a thorough investigation to find her attacker. The nation was reeling from the shocking crime, and the pressure was on to bring the perpetrator to justice. The search was exhaustive, and the authorities left no stone unturned in their quest for answers. Eventually, they uncovered evidence that led them to Hollis Service, Bergen's ex-husband. It was a chilling revelation, one that sent shivers down the spine of the nation. The thought that someone could carry out such a brutal attack on someone they had once professed to love was almost too much to bear. It was discovered that Hollis had ordered the attack, hiring a hitman to throw nitric acid in Bergen's face. The fact that he had previously threatened Bergen with such an attack if she ever tried to leave him made the crime all that more heinous. However, this time, Bergen did try to distance herself from him, and as a result, Hollis carried out his evil plan. Hollis was eventually arrested and sentenced to 13 years in prison for his crime. The sentence was a small comfort to Bergen, who never fully recovered from her injuries. The attack had left a deep scar on her life, both physically and emotionally. It was a trauma that would stay with her forever, a haunting reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. But despite the unimaginable pain and suffering she had endured, Bergen refused to let the attack define her. She was a strong and resilient woman, a true fighter who refused to let the darkness consume her. Her story became a source of inspiration for many, a beacon of hope for those who had suffered in silence. The acid attack left a lasting impact on Bergen's life and music career. Before the tragedy, she was a bright star in the Turkish music scene, captivating audiences with her enchanting voice and stage presence. After the acid attack, Bergen's life took a drastic turn. She was left partially blind and scarred, both physically and emotionally. It was a difficult journey with years of healing needed for both her body and mind. Bergen had to adapt to a new life, living in a new world that she couldn't avoid. She faced depression, anxiety, and the trauma of her past, but still her love for music never faded. Determined to heal and regain her place in the music industry, Bergen committed to extensive medical treatments. She faced countless surgeries, skin grafts, and procedures to restore her appearance. Music found its way back into her heart, and she composed songs that reflected her journey. She knew the road ahead was tough, but she was determined to face any trials with the same spirit that had carried her through already. She released several albums, each one a tribute to her resilience and her strength as an artist. Her music became a symbol of hope, showing that even the darkest moments could be overcome with perseverance and determination. Bergen also used her platform to speak out against domestic violence. She became an advocate, shedding light on this important issue. Through the benevolent collaboration with composer Cengiz Özgür, Bergen orchestrated her grand return in 1983, gracing the stage at the club owned by Özgür himself in Izmir. It was a tumultuous period for Bergen as the specter of the attack continued to haunt her, leaving emotional scars that were slow to heal. Her music continued to resonate deeply within the hearts of her listeners throughout Turkey. In 1985, Bergen unveiled her album İnsan Severs, a critical and commercial tour de force that served as a testament to her enduring resilience and prodigious talent. It was a poignant reminder that even in the face of adversity, Bergen remained a formidable presence in the music world. She continued her triumphant ascent with the release of her subsequent album Aşinar Kadına in late 1986. Selling over 1 million copies and garnering numerous accolades, it marked a redemptive moment for Bergen, who had weathered incredible storms to regain her hard-earned position. In 1987, she ventured into uncharted territory with her acting debut in the film Woman of Pain, written and directed by Utku Irakalin. Embracing this novel challenge with her characteristic enthusiasm and prowess, Bergen embarked on yet another creative journey. However, tragedy struck once more as she prepared for a concert in Adana when a photographer lunged at her with a knife, leaving her wounded. Although Bergen survived the attack with only minor injuries, it served as a chilling reminder of the perils that lurked in the shadows for a public figure of her stature. In defiance of the attack, Bergen persisted in her performance and music production, her spirit unbroken and her talent undimmed. In the years that followed, she crafted and released a series of albums including Burn Him to God, Sevgimin Bedeli, and İstemi Yorum. Meanwhile, it was evident that Bergen's relationship with service was a tangled web of emotions and complexities haunting her until her final days. Bergen's ascent to stardom was as swift as it was brilliant, yet it was tragically paralleled by the darkness that enshrouded her personal life, which was marred by violence and sorrow. In the end, it was the very violence that had once targeted her that ultimately consumed her. News of Bergen's brutal murder spread like a ravenous blaze, sending shockwaves rippling through Turkey's music industry. Fans and loved ones alike grieved the loss of one of the nation's most gifted and cherished artists. The chilling circumstances of her murder cast a long shadow over Bergen's life. Hollis Service, the very man who had tormented and abused her for years, had finally unleashed his darkest impulses. In the past, he had threatened Bergen and her mother repeatedly, but on this fateful day, he made good on his ominous promises. As Bergen stood with her back turned to the flowers, Service drew a gun and fired without hesitation. The gunshots pierced the serenity of the day, and Bergen crumpled to the ground, succumbing to her mortal wounds. Bergen's mother, who had also been injured in the brutal attack, would later recount the harrowing moments leading up to her daughter's death. The raw pain and indelible trauma of that day would haunt her for the rest of her life, serving as a constant and agonizing reminder of the senseless violence that had ripped her daughter from her embrace. In the wake of the murder, a pall of mourning descended upon the nation. Fans and supporters, hearts heavy with grief, left flowers and messages of condolences at Bergen's final resting place in Tarsus, Mersin, Turkey. Bergen's mother, who had been her unwavering supporter and guardian, was consumed by inconsolable grief. The overwhelming pain of her daughter's passing weighed heavily upon her, and she withdrew into herself, donning black attire each day and speaking to Bergen's memory as if she still walked among the living. Despite the anguish and trauma that marked Bergen's tragic death, her enduring legacy continues to shine. Her music, imbued with life and passion, still resonates with fans today, and her story serves as a beacon of hope and inspiration for countless women who have faced the horrors of abuse and violence. The story of Bergen Serial Miser is a harrowing and poignant one, illustrating the far-reaching consequences of domestic violence, the unwavering strength of the human spirit, and the resilience of a woman who refused to let darkness define her life. Abusive relationships are often characterized by a pattern of control and power, where one partner seeks to dominate and manipulate the other. Service crimes against Bergen began in 1977 when he first beat her up, leaving her with a fractured skull. Despite the gravity of this attack, Bergen forgave him and returned to live with him, perhaps hoping that he would change. Unfortunately, the cycle of violence only intensified. Service possessiveness and jealousy drove him to commit increasingly brutal acts against Bergen, culminating in the acid attack and eventually her murder. One cannot help but wonder how many other women have suffered similar fates at the hands of abusive partners, their stories untold and their voices silenced by fear. How can society ensure that no other woman has to endure the pain and suffering that Bergen faced? First and foremost, it is essential to strengthen the legal framework surrounding domestic violence. Laws must be enacted to protect victims and ensure that perpetrators are held accountable for their actions. Education is another crucial component in the fight against domestic abuse. By raising awareness of the issue and promoting healthy relationship dynamics, society can empower women to recognize the signs of abuse and seek help before it is too late. The importance of a strong support network cannot be overstated, as it can mean the difference between life and death for those trapped in the cycle of abuse. Despite the unspeakable pain and suffering he had inflicted upon her, Bergen chose to forgive him and even resumed contact with him after his release from prison. It is a decision that baffles and frustrates many, leaving them to question why she would return to the man who had caused her so much harm. While it is impossible to know for certain what motivated Bergen's actions, her decision may have been influenced by a complex interplay of emotional, psychological, and societal factors. The cycle of abuse can create a powerful bond between the abuser and the victim, making it difficult for the latter to break free from the relationship. Moreover, societal pressures and expectations may have played a role in her decision to reconcile with Service, as she struggled to navigate the stigma and shame that often accompanies being a survivor of domestic violence. This also highlights another chilling aspect of Bergen's story: the fact that her mother, who had been her staunchest defender and protector, was ultimately unable to save her from Service's violent rage. In her desperate attempt to shield her daughter from harm, Bergen's mother found herself caught in the crossfire, suffering injuries of her own during the fatal confrontation. The pain and guilt she must have felt in the wake of Bergen's death is unimaginable, a burden that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The story of Bergen's murder also underscores the importance of addressing the pervasive issue of gun violence. The ease with which Service was able to obtain a firearm and use it to carry out his heinous act raises questions about the need for stricter gun control laws and regulations. By implementing measures to prevent firearms from falling into the hands of dangerous individuals, we may be able to reduce the risk of such tragedies occurring in the future. As we reflect on the life and legacy of Bergen Serial Miser, we are reminded of the indomitable spirit that enabled her to overcome unimaginable adversity and continue to pursue her passion for music. Even in the face of darkness and despair, she never lost her determination to live her life to the fullest, inspiring countless others with her courage and resilience. It is through her music that she continues to touch the hearts and minds of those who hear it, serving as a beacon of hope and a testament to the power of the human spirit. Yet, even as we celebrate Bergen's triumphs, we cannot ignore the lingering questions and unresolved issues that her story raises. How can we, as a society, work to prevent the kind of violence that ultimately claimed her life? What measures can be put in place to protect and support women who find themselves trapped in abusive relationships? And how can we change the cultural norms and the attitudes that perpetuate the cycle of abuse and silence the voices of its victims? The answers to these questions may not come easily, but they are crucial to our efforts to create a world where women like Bergen can live free from fear and violence. By engaging in open and honest dialogue about the realities of domestic abuse and the impact it has on the lives of its victims, we can begin to chip away at the stigma and shame that often surround this issue. By fostering greater understanding and empathy, we can work towards creating a more compassionate and supportive environment for survivors as they seek to heal and rebuild their lives. The haunting story of Bergen's serial miser serves as a powerful reminder of the devastating impact that domestic violence can have on the lives of its victims and their families. As we work to create a world where women can live free from fear and violence, let us draw inspiration from Bergen's life and legacy, and strive to honor her memory by fighting for the rights and dignity of all women. In conclusion, the tragic tale of Bergen's serial miser serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of domestic violence and the urgent need for society to confront and address this pervasive issue. While the story of Bergen's serial miser may have come to a tragic end, her memory lives on through her music and the powerful impact she had on those who knew her. Thank you so much for watching Killer Bites. I'm Allie, and I'll see you next time.